Thank you for joining us again. This is a continuation of the previous episode. As always, here's your host, Nikesh Gosalia.
While I was listening to you talk about, SSP, and we've had numerous discussions around this particular topic, which is, technology and use of AI. Just wanted to hear your thoughts, Duncan. How do you think it's going to pan out in our industry? I know for a fact a few years back, there was a lot of jargons being used, AI and blockchain, and we're starting to see some of it happening. But just from your perspective, based on your experience, how do you see that playing out?
I think there was a point, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you're right, when we first started hearing these terms, it seemed a bit to a lot of people like a solution in search of a problem. I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic that was really interesting was in 2020, this boom of content. And I think it was pretty much universal across the board. I mean, it threw all the metric, every journal metric was absolutely thrown because of this anomalous year where people were just submitting so much content. And it wasn't just COVID content. There were people who, all of a sudden had an opportunity to get caught up on writing because they weren't, at their research institutions physically. And so even journals that have nothing to do whatsoever with COVID saw these huge booms. I mean, at the same time, there's the underlying increasing output, especially from China and Korea and India and these markets where we're starting to see, more and more submissions come every year. I think now we've got a situation where there is a problem that requires a solution. And so the problem is that editorial offices are just overwhelmed with submissions. It's the variable you have no control over as a journal. You open up your submission system and you say, here you go, submit to this journal. You cannot control how many people submit. So there's no way to cap it. So if you've got a staff that is, has been brought about to handle 1,000 manuscripts a year, and you've got an editorial board that is constructed to handle 1,000 manuscripts a year, and then all of a sudden you're receiving 1,500, 2,000 a year, you've got a serious problem on your hands. So tools that have been developed and are being used now and will be developed to handle editorial triage is huge. Improving manuscripts prior to review, connecting manuscripts to the appropriate journal through use of AI. There's because we don't control where manuscripts get submitted, there's an incredible amount of inefficiency in terms of authors who, through no fault of their own, I certainly don't want to point the finger, but just submitting to the wrong journal. The number of rejected manuscripts that occur simply because an author has sent their manuscript to a journal that it's not within the journal's scope, it's not really what they published, it's an article type they don't usually handle. These are things that I think technology can assist with. Directing rejected manuscripts to the appropriate next journal in line is hugely important. And so I think there are a lot of solutions that now seem to have a value that probably didn't 3 or 4 years ago. There was very little, or not very little, but I would say that the amount of journals that sort of were actively complaining about being overwhelmed by submissions was probably a third of what it is now, because there's just so much more content, and tools that can handle that don't involve hiring just more and more people is going to be of enormous value to editorial offices moving forward.
Another topic that we've spoken a lot about, Duncan, is just, research communication and science communication. We know for a fact that a lot of the consumption going forward is changing in terms of maybe moving from reading a whole manuscript to, shorter formats, videos, infographics. We know for a fact that there's a lot of requirements, expectations, even from funders to say, what is the real ROI on all of the research that's happening? And suddenly, I think over the last 2.5, 3 years, the importance of engagement, dissemination, communications grown a lot. I know that you're a firm believer in that as well, Duncan. But just again, from your perspective, what do you see, has changed, and what do you think, is probably going to kind of be further accentuated in the next few years? Yeah,
it's funny about this because I'll admit I was not a firm believer. Maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was very much like, show me the data, And I remember, and I won't mention the product, but I remember piloting a product 6 or 7 years ago, and it was about, spreading the word through social media. And I remember at the end of the pilot just sort of saying, great. So we spent all this money and we got 2 citations out of it. Where is the ROI, as you said? I think that I've come around on this because for the first time now, we really are seeing data that shows that citations are different for open access articles and different for articles that have been consumed in different ways. So I think as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, you could make the argument that none of this stuff makes any difference. And, an article can have an altmetric score of 20,000. That doesn't necessarily mean it has any more citations. And ultimately, for most journals, citations is what's going to matter to them. I think now one of the side effects of having so much content out there is that we're constantly now trying to figure out ways to be heard through the noise, right? So you could say, okay, well, you need to be in the indexes. Well, now, the indexes are full of content. Okay, well, now we need to be on Twitter. Well, now there's all these articles on Twitter. Okay, so now you have to have a video that goes with Twitter, or now you have to be on TikTok or wherever it is. And I think there are now correlations between not just, articles receiving that kind of exposure and drawing more eyes to the journal. It's become, I think part of this is for a long time, it was very article focused. And I think now, and even journals who participated, it was mostly around content. I think the shift now is to do things that are a little more based around journal branding, which is something a lot of journals didn't have to worry about for a long time because, as I kind of mentioned before, if you're the journal of blank, then you don't really have to advertise yourself. You're going to be in every reference list and, and every editorial board member is going to be well known and this kind of thing. You have an advantage. I'm not sure that exists to the same extent anymore. So all of these other things that are now available to journals, I think are important, not just for promoting individual articles, but have become a lot more important in establishing a brand. I'm not sure to what degree there's brand loyalty in publishing, but I do think that there's something to be said for, look, if I'm an author and I'm writing a paper and I'm already thinking about the 3 or 4 places that I'm going to submit that article. You want your journal to be in that list of 3 or 4. And I think engaging in social media, especially for up and coming researchers who are so much more active in those venues than the old guard, let's say, that's going to have some significance to it. And it's something that I think we're always kind of looking for to draw these correlations. But I only imagine those correlations will get stronger as the years go on.
Very interesting comments. And I think that's something that I've heard over the last 12 to 18 months as well. And it's starting to change to some extent, Duncan, where a lot of conversations early on would be around, okay, this is probably nice to have. And just building on that, one question for you, just based on your experience, your perspective, what do you think could lead to a tipping point where, we start saying, okay, this is probably a must-have? I mean, maybe I've assumed a few things here. Do you think we can reach a stage where, it can move from nice to have to a must-have? And if so, what could trigger that?
Ultimately, for most editors, if you can show them that Group A got more citations per article than Group B, and the variable was this implementation of a new product. And I think, as I say, and I think there's some debate about this, but just anecdotally, from my perspective, when I did some analysis of the 2020 impact factors across the Wolters Kluwer portfolio, it was the first time that I'd run that data where there was a clear citation advantage to open access articles, not for open access journals over non-open access journals, but within the same journal who had a hybrid journal that offers both options, right? That there was a clear citation advantage for articles within that journal that were open access over subscription articles that were behind a paywall. And that was the first time I'd seen that universally across the board. Every journal I looked at that was hybrid, the open access articles had more citations. That's the argument that no editor is going to ignore. The next thing would be, okay, so the variable there was open access. The next variable is, okay, well, what are the articles that received formalized Twitter promotion? Did they receive higher citations? Okay, what were the articles that had an accompanying infographic or video abstract? did they receive more citations? Because I think that puts it in a language that editors understand. It's hard to say. It's clearer in open access because there's a much more direct connection between submissions and revenue. So it's easy in an open access journal to say, look, if our impact factor goes up by 0.5, we generate 20% more submissions, which generates 18% more revenue. So we can literally say this resulted in more money. For subscription journals, it may be there may be more variables involved, or there may be more nuance. But I think when you can start drawing those direct correlations between promotional activity on an article and citation activity down the road, then you're speaking to something that editors can clearly understand. That'll be the tipping point. I think the tipping point with OA is probably getting there. And it's a hard thing to track. The other part of this too that makes it difficult is that, an article gets published and it immediately is receiving social media, attention. It's immediately getting an altmetric score, but it's not going to get citations for a minimum, let's say realistically, of 6 to 9 months before it even sees a single citation. It's not going to see the bulk of its citations for 12 to 18 months. So there's a big delay there between those two activities. So it takes some patience to be able to make those correlations.
Very interesting. Talking a little bit about Wolters Kluwer Health, obviously, a hugely prestigious brand, everybody knows. But just from your perspective, how does it help researchers? And maybe a second question to that, what do we as a society, get from it?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the Wolters Kluwer Health, Wolters Kluwer encompasses more than just journals. And I think one of the things that we're fairly siloed often journals management and publishing, but there are other products that Wolters Kluwer owns that address greater part of the lifespan. And actually last week we had an internal presentation from the product Up to Date, which is a physician based product where physicians are actually looking up expert recommendations, background on disease states and diagnosis. And it's a point of care tool. Drawing the line between a research paper and its conclusions ending up in a recommendation in Up to Date where there's a direct impact on a patient who's in a doctor's office is difficult to do. And the Up to Date folks actually describe that as sort of the holy grail. But that is ultimately what we do and what other commercial publishers do. The lifespan of the article doesn't end when we publish it. We're part of this beginning process. That research article ultimately gets read by other researchers. Societies play an enormous part in developing practice guidelines within their specialty. Those practice guidelines then trickle down to the physicians who are actually dealing with patients. And so it's not unreasonable to draw, to say, here's this research paper and it goes through these steps. And then eventually patient care is impacted positively by this. And we see it, more often than you would imagine. We see papers that are published by our journals that talk about significant changes in how a particular disease state is dealt with, or a particular specialty area, and that change the way it does diagnoses to make it more efficient, more accurate. Those have real impact on patient care later on. So ultimately, our initial mission is, to publish great research. Ultimately, our mission is to improve patient care.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Duncan. That was extremely useful. One final question from my side. I know that, a lot of listeners would be quite curious to know, how do you keep yourself updated with publishing related news, or should I say science related news?
In the publishing industry in general, I think it is a relatively small community in reality. The overlap of people that you and I know is probably huge. And so I think there's a lot of personal connections in this industry that may not exist in industries that are maybe more broad in terms of the number of people involved. People move around. We keep in touch. So if you've been in the industry for X number of years, eventually you know somebody everywhere. You know what people are working on. In the sort of technological development, it's probably an even smaller group. So that's one way. I think it's just personal connections that you have are really interesting. We do have, the 2 or 3 main meetings that, now obviously we're going to go to in person. Those are great. I think there's been a boom in webinars and podcasts over the last 2 years to make up for for the lack of those meetings. And the technology is now there for us to do those things. So I think there's a lot of different ways. One thing, for example, as well at Wolters Kluwer, we have a mentor program to really sort of bring new employees, younger employees into the fold of here's how you kind of get connected in the industry. So, that's a valuable tool as well. But it's such a people-driven industry that I think really that's the main one. And it's not networking in terms of, we don't necessarily have sort of events where people, wear name tags and meet each other. It's very organic in terms of how people come into contact with each other and how people tend to stay in the industry for a long time. So I think that's really been the main way that people meet. So, for example, you and I, when we first partnered with Cactus, I was working with Don Samolak a lot. And then I was in Philadelphia. You attended a meeting there, and we've known each other for, 10 years. And we compare notes.
We certainly do that, Duncan. And yeah, and I agree with you. I think that's actually something that I did not think so deeply about, that it's a very people-focused industry, and it is definitely a small world. And that probably is, one of the most important channels to stay in touch.
Yeah.
So brilliant. Thank you so much, Duncan. I think this was fascinating as always. And, if I were to share a few insights just as a summary of our discussion, I know that you spoke about the importance of smarter processes. So, things like triage, desk rejects, the importance of peer review, of course. And even in the general context, it's very important, but especially in medical publishing, I think it becomes all the more critical, especially, because it has a patient impact. We spoke about technology, and it's interesting. You mentioned maybe 4 or 5 years back, things were a little difficult, a little fuzzy, a lot of jargon being used. But now some of the technology solutions clearly has value in a few areas. We spoke about research, communication, research, promotion. And I think you rightly pointed out that the tipping point will happen when there's a more direct correlation between, the promotional activities and the kind of change in citation, the growth in citation that we would see. And finally, just spoke about Wolters Kluwer Health and the kind of impact that the group's having. It's not just getting papers published, but a lot of activities that happen actually, after that. But yeah, as always, really, really great to talk to you, Duncan. And we literally can go on and on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could go on for another hour about this.
I know. We can literally go on for an hour, and then we can, probably switch gears, talk about football and so many other things as well, as we always do. So
I don't want to talk about football.
Yeah, probably, we'll save it for some other day.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks a lot. Always good to talk to you. And I'm looking forward to running into you and having a drink in Chicago.
Likewise, Duncan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can subscribe to this podcast on all major podcast platforms. Stay tuned for our next episode.
All Things SciComm is brought to you by ScienceTalks, a science media channel that aims to make science accessible to all. We publish articles, videos, podcasts, and magazines. To read a transcript of this episode or watch it on YouTube, visit ScienceTalks.org. Also, write to us with your views, questions, and guest recommendations at contact@sciencetalks.org. Science Talks, bringing science to you.